wanted to use really short.
Also, I wanted you to talk a little bit for maybe the person or even a leader who maybe are going through a time where they don't even feel God's presence. I mean, I'm sure that's something that happens a lot of times to people where they feel like, well, I don't feel like I'm getting any direction. How do you, in those times, how do you lean on the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. Well, first of all, realize that it's more than normal. It's almost the regular experience of many of the greatest Christians that have ever lived. King David, a lot of the Psalms are basically David asking God, "Where are you?" Jeremiah was that way. God, I feel like you've forsaken me. Some of the great Christians through history, C.S. Lewis, which everybody loves to quote, in A Grief Observed, he talks about, I went to God when my need was the greatest, and instead of having the warming, embrace of God, I felt like it was a door slammed in my face, and I could hear the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. And he's like, somehow that never makes it on everyone's favorite C.S. Lewis board, but
That doesn't get tweeted, no.
so what do you do in situations like that? And there's two things that I think are essential. One, realize that the sense that God has abandoned you is just an illusion. It's just an illusion. And the reason we know that is because in Gethsemane is where Jesus actually was forsaken by God. Here we got the Son of God who 3 times in the Garden of Gethsemane calls out for God his Father, and every single time he's met by silence, to the point that Jesus would say, my God, why have you forsaken me? We know that he was forsaken for us. He was forsaken because of God's wrath against my sin. And because Jesus took my sin upon himself, when I go through a time that feels like Gethsemane, I know that he hasn't forsaken me because he forsook Jesus in my place. So it's an illusion. Martin Luther said it's an illusion that God now uses to strengthen our faith. He said, just like the parent will push against the hand of a child with only enough resistance to kind of, let the child strengthen himself. He's like, that's what God is doing with us. He's allowing the sense that he's not there to strengthen our understanding of who he is and what he's doing. And that leads me to the second thing, and that is that some of the greatest work that God does in our lives happens in times when he feels like he's the most absent. I use one biblical example with you. King David is anointed by Samuel to be the new king of Israel. And that had to be an awesome moment. I mean, here he is, the shepherd, now he's going to be king of Israel. So what happened right after that? Did he, get whisked off to the palace to try on robes? No. If you look at what happens is after he anoints him, the very next verse, something else starts happening. God goes on to something else. Then, a little while later, David gets called to go to the thing where he meets Goliath. But there's like 7 years that transpire between when David is called and when the next thing happens in his life. I've often wondered, what was that period like for David? In my Bible, it's only represented by a little white space.
Right.
And I'm like, what is that white space like for David? I mean, here he is, like, I'm supposed to be king, and then now I'm back in the pasture, shoveling sheep dung, and chasing animals around. But it was in that white space that God did his best work in David. It's where David would later say he learned to fight the lion and the bear, got the skills that would allow him to defeat Goliath. It was in that white space that David learned the concepts that later became the 23rd Psalm, the most famous Christian worship song ever written. All that stuff happened in the pasture. And the point is that when it feels like a white space to us, that's when God is doing his best writing in us. It's when he was doing his best writing in David. And the times I feel like that are when he's doing best writing in me.